Hello, beautiful community. A quick analytical take on Putin's inauguration and the latest nuclear blackmail coming from the Kremlin. Putin's the author of an unconstitutional constitutional coup in 2020, and that's what gets him to this position of being inaugurated. So if for no other reason except that one, he is not a legitimate leader of that country. And this is something the Russian opposition could do much more to squeeze juice out of and exploit. In terms of what the Russian population think about that, they think that he is neither legitimate nor illegitimate predominantly, simply because they're a population and not citizens. So Putin for them is just an unalterable reality. Now, the text Putin had to swear by feels out of date and itself reflects this tension between politicization and depoliticization in Russia that the regime is simultaneously balancing and pursuing. Putin had to swear by protecting the rights and liberties of Russian citizens. But that discourse is already in of itself, more or less, an example of what Kremlin calls Western ideological dogma inserted into Russian political life in order to undermine the Kremlin. But the fact that Putin still had to recite that stuff is a nice illustration of how far that process of politicizing the population is still very much in its inception. We're ready to cooperate with the West so long as they stop their aggression toward us, Putin said. And the translation for that is that we are waiting for the multiplication of Trump's, Le Pen's and Orban's in the West so that Western democratic decline leads the West to negotiate with us without forcing us to give up our imperialist demands. Those who've been in battle, Putin said, and this is an important and politicizing repetition of a point is made many times, those who have been in battle will be economically, socially, and institutionally elevated. An interesting question is how many people in the audience, Class B, Class C, and Class A, members of Putin's regime, were wishing that he were gone and that they could turn back the clock to February 2022. Now, you know that I think that that's an illusion, and it's also an illusion when Western leaders fall for that fantasy. But it's an interesting question how many people sitting there as Putin spoke actually were having a fantasy about his disappearance. If you take it as a percentage, it would be certainly a percentage in the double figures. Psychologically, my quick observation is that Putin is even more corrosively isolated than he's ever been, to the point that one now worries that even people in his inner circle, folks like the Kovalchuk brothers, may no longer be able to break through to him because he is simply now in a conversation with history. And his conception of Russia, roughly, is that he is Russia, right? And we've endlessly talked about how he started on this path between 2010 and 2014 with his missionary turn, his turn towards seeing his own political project as expressing the collective realization of Russian culture. And now that has got more contorted, more grandiose, more paranoid, more isolated. Nuclear blackmail, clunky statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Upon the instruction of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, with the aim of elevating the readiness of non-strategic nuclear forces for the fulfillment of military tasks, the General Staff has begun preparations for holding an exercise in the near future with missile formations of the Southern Military District with aviation and naval forces, in response to provocative statements and threats made by Western officials. And we have an interview with Peskov, who talks about statements that he is not happy with from the French leader, from the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and so on. It's not for me to discuss the significance of these exercises being about non-strategic rather than strategic nuclear weapons. It's not my expertise. And I don't need to say anything about how concerned we should be, because quite frankly, you're not concerned. And I'm not concerned at this stage, particularly because the Putin regime is in a relatively stable position, having been on the rocks for quite a while during the first 2 years of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But a slight warning here to us, and that is that when we meet here, we are in an algorithmic bubble that somewhat rewards minimizing the nuclear risk that the Kremlin poses, and that's worth being aware about. So let's do a little bit of analysis here. There is a video, I think, on the main channel. It's the last video before the war, I think, the full-scale war, where I talk about nuclear blackmail being nearly the central feature of Russian quote-unquote diplomacy as we go forward with witnessing the Putin regime in the 2020s. Now, there was a point during the war when I was very critical of a new trend of thought which came along and said the Chinese have turned off Russia's nuclear blackmail. And it was very clear that that's not what happened, that couldn't have happened, and that nuclear blackmail was always going to come back as soon as the Kremlin felt that it was either convenient or necessary. So we're never going to get to a situation where that stuff is turned off. It is a primary tool of this regime. And it is rather a matter of piety and wishful thinking to think that we could just get it turned off. We're stuck with it. A helpful thing for you to understand is that if Putin were to use non-strategic nuclear weapons in Ukraine, whatever else is true, my political analysis is that he couldn't do that without significant fear of destabilization at home. Making a decision like that for Putin, quite aside from it being of unobvious military function, but making a decision like that for Putin would constitute a domestic destabilization, a threat to regime security, as significant, and I would argue more significant, than declaring a major and overt second wave of mobilization. This is about our sense of where the population is at and our sense of his sense of what creates ripples and what is allowed to pass. But we can also rely on polls here, and a recent poll by Russian Field, who do excellent work, asked what Russians thought about the permissibility or impermissibility of the use of nuclear weapons by the Kremlin in Ukraine if such a use was militarily necessitated in the judgment of the Kremlin. And something like 74% of the population said that it would not be permissible, even if there seemed to be good reasons for it. So what I want to say is that Putin couldn't use non-strategic nuclear weapons in Ukraine without creating a significant risk of domestic destabilization. This may change if in the future, 3-4 years from now, he has a much more politicized situation. But today, he would regard such usage as a significant threat to the stability of his regime. let me just briefly reiterate that insofar as I recommend a worry about Putin and nuclear weapons, it is less a worry about the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons and more a worry about the apocalyptic nature of the Putin regime and the fact that even though I don't cast that regime in religious terms, I cast it in mystical terms, but nevertheless, if you crudely want to put a kind of, a placeholder on the table and contrast this regime with the regime of Brezhnev, what you've got here is something that's closer to certain kinds of religious fundamentalism than it is to the regimes of late Soviet communism. That's to say that certain kinds of John Mearsheimer type rationality might do a very good job of capturing how a Brezhnev or a Khrushchev regime might operate on the global stage and what risks it might take. That analysis could largely be derived from international relations and economics textbooks. But I'm saying that Putin, while of course being rational, requires a wider conception of rationality to capture him that allows for various kinds of mystical and apocalyptic motivations. And that is why he does constitute a global nuclear risk that we've got to take seriously and that we also cannot eliminate, of course, by conceding to Putin. We are stuck with the nuclear risk if we concede to him, and we are potentially stuck with it if we try to beat him. So there's no soft compromise available to us here of the kind a lot of people like to recommend. But the point is that if I'm worried about anything, it is that narrow conceptions of rationality we often use don't fit that regime, and that does raise certain questions. Now, if you want to watch more, there are 2 videos on the main channel about this. One is about the kind of rationality with which Putin approaches nuclear weapons, and another is just a kind of a moral condemnation of the disgrace that regime is when they keep repeatedly threatening nuclear weapons. And as a moral philosopher, I want to be very clear here. It is in itself a special kind of moral failure, a moral offense to threaten nuclear weapons, even if you're not going to get anywhere near to using them. That in itself is, in my view, a grievous moral offense, and everybody in that Putin regime, once that regime collapses, who is engaged in this, needs to be held accountable in the future. Lots of love and talk soon.